what I would tell you is that falling away is possible. Now, this is not a lesson about that. Matter of fact, we could spend 4 or 5 classes talking about the warnings of falling away. But instead of that, we're going to look at it through the positive lens of sustaining. And what's interesting is that the writer of Hebrews did exactly the same thing. The writer of Hebrews looked at it through the positive perspective. And both perspectives are worth study, worth knowing, and worth taking on as Christians. We should look for warnings in Scripture. A lot of times with warnings, though, you don't as much see the solution. So after seeing the warnings, then you need to look for the solution. And really what we're talking about here is sustaining. I thought what Keith said the other night, he mentioned John 20, verses 30 and 31, very much so in the positive. I'll remind you of the verse that says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So both attaining faith and sustaining faith. So this morning, as we jump into our study, we're going to spend our focus on how do we sustain our faith, and what does Scripture tell us through that positive lens about sustaining faith. Anybody in here ever run a marathon? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, I'm not a marathoner. I don't know if that's what you'd call someone that's run a marathon, but I'm not a marathoner. Anybody have any idea why I picked this picture of a marathon? You see the guy in the white shirt back there? I just kind of like that hook 'em horns thing he had going on his shirts. I was looking at different pictures. I was looking through different. I knew Audie was going to give me a horns down when I said it. Carl said, "You notice he's not in first place." That's a fact. I don't see any crimson up there either, fella. Oh, that's true. That's true. Yes, that's right. Carl is in first. Okay. I've never run a marathon. I have never run a marathon. But what's interesting about marathons, and what I think is really worthwhile about a marathon in this study, is that there are very few things that we can look at to think about, to build analogies off of, related to the Christian race that we are to run. Few things are better in our modern time than a marathon. The marathon, just a few fun facts for you first, just because I think it might be fun. First became an Olympic event in the modern era of the Olympics in 1896. And it originally covered, you know how many miles? 25 miles. That's what it originally covered. And then in 1908, at the London Olympics, it was the first time that it was run at 26.2 miles. And by the way, 26.2 miles does not round off to any number of kilometers or anything like that. The reason it was 26.2 miles is that the Queen, since it was in London, changed the route a bit so her kids could see it. And that made it go from 25 miles to 26.2, and just a few years later after that, it became the standard. Matter of fact, it was 1924 when 26.2 miles became the standard. Did any of you guys ever do a walkathon when you were growing up? I did the walkathon, which was that same 26.2 miles. That's a long way. A few facts for you. Number one, on marathons, age doesn't matter. At 100 years old, Fawjit Singh became the oldest person to run a marathon in 2011. Now you say, okay, big deal. Well, he ran this marathon in 8 hours and 25 minutes. That's averaging 3 miles per hour, walking 3 miles, 100 years old, averaging 3 miles per hour walking speed. The average person over the age of 65 walks 2.1 miles an hour. I walk somewhere around 1.1 miles an hour. So you think about that, for someone that's 100 years old to maintain 3 miles per hour, that's pretty amazing. By the way, it's not just people that run marathons. There's a marathon in Wales, which I would love to see, which human runners race against horses, and humans have won twice. Those are bad horses. I would enter any of my 3 horses in that race happily. The largest marathon in the world is the New York Marathon. It has typically around 45,000 runners. The Boston Marathon is probably the most well-known. It's the oldest annual marathon. It became an annual marathon in 1897. The world record in a marathon is 2 hours, 3 minutes, and 38 seconds. That's moving on average 13 miles an hour. Some guy named Patrick Masayoki. The fastest marathon run backwards, 3 hours and 43 minutes. Kind of amazing. And the first marathon in space was in 2011, where an astronaut ran it in 4 hours and 24 minutes during the same time as the Boston Marathon. Last couple of things that are worth noting. This is more to the point of where we're headed on how we compare a marathon. Couple of them are funny, but they're worth knowing. After you run a marathon, your nose runs more. Believe it or not. I don't really have a great explanation. You get temporarily shorter by about a half inch. Your toenails might go black or fall off completely. You lose 1.5 gallons of water weight. As a matter of fact, the combined amount of water lost through sweat, the combined amount of sweated in the London Marathon in 2018 would have filled 2,340 bathtubs. You feel like a genius after you run that long. You know why? Because your endorphins and all kick in, and it really freshens your mind. You burn 10 Big Macs worth of calories. Anybody that knows me well knows I like my Big Macs. And you burn enough energy to charge your iPhone for an entire year. Those are things that happen when you run a marathon. What does it take to be successful? Well, I'm not a marathon runner, but the best say this, that you have to be as lightweight as possible. You have to have great training. You have to have the right nutrition and hydration. And you have to have the right focus. That's what it takes to run a marathon. Where did marathon come from? Well, there was we know of it at least as a legend. Well, we don't know if it's true, but we know that this legend has been around for thousands of years. That actually this legend was talked about even during the time of Christ. Phidippides was an Athenian messenger who supposedly in 450 BC, when the Greeks had finally won their battle against the Persians, he ran from the field of Marathon, the battle of Marathon, back to Athens, which was approximately 25 miles. And when he got there, he declared Nike. That sound familiar? Nenikekium, victory, victory, rejoice, we conquer. And then he promptly collapsed of exhaustion and died. That's the legend. Now, some say that he actually would have run more like 150 miles that day. He was not an athlete runner. He had a job in the Greek military. And that job was to carry messages back and forth. I would have done it with a horse. But there were men who had this role, and he was one of those men, which meant he often ran this type of distance. That's where a marathon came from. The only reason it's worth me telling you about that is that as we spend time reading what Paul wrote and others, but particularly Paul, we know that Paul at least knew sports. It seems like he liked sports, but he certainly knew sports. And he often, multiple times in Scripture, pointed towards a race and talked about the Christian race with this linkage to a run. And it's likely the way he talked about it and the way we're going to see that the Hebrew writer talked about it, that it was pointed towards this marathon run that likely was well known certainly to him because he was 450 years afterwards. 1 Corinthians 9:24, he said, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run?" Acts 20:24, if you'll notice what I bolded, there he said, "But I do not account my life for of any value, nor as precious to myself, if only I may finish my course." Well, that my course, by the way, is dramos. That's the Greek word, and that means a course, but it specifically means a course as in a race. So Paul's calling out the same thing here. 1 Corinthians 9, he says, "I do not run aimlessly, run with purpose." And Galatians 5:7 says, "You were running well, who hindered you from obeying the truth?" And then, my favorite that we know was Paul was for 2 Timothy 4:7-8. This is the second letter that Paul was writing to Timothy, and in so many ways was an encouragement. And it was an encouragement because that was at the end of Paul's life. The first letter, he wasn't at the end. He was nearing the end, but he wasn't at the end. And in this one, Paul was at the end. And so you find this extra maybe intensity from Paul towards Timothy with instruction and encouragement from someone who may not be there for him long term. And this is what he said. He said, "I've fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I've kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." I started doing this weird thing years ago. You guys know I love quotes, but in my business life, in my desk at my office, if I came across a great quote, I used to kind of hold on to them for a while. But there were a couple one of them I had taped on my desk for a long time. And what it said was, "If you don't like bad news, get out of the leadership business." And I had that taped on my desk because I had so many leaders that would come into my office and whine about the bad news that they dealt with. And I kind of figured out myself and learned through my own trials that that's a big part of leadership, is you're helping people get through the difficulties that they face. And so that was a quote that said, "Hey, if you're a leader, embrace it. Get your arms around it, embrace it." Another great quote, and one of my favorites, and I actually have had this up on my wall in my office now for 10 plus years. It was Vince Lombardi. Now I want you to listen to this quote. He said, "Winning is not a sometime thing. It's an all the time thing. You don't win once in a while. You don't do the right things right once in a while. You do them right all the time." Those were things that I've had in business to encourage me forward. I would submit to you that I'm not sure there's a better place in Scripture than this verse, or than these verses, these two verses, for us to have taped on our desk, for us to have written on our eyelids, than this, to encourage us to fight the good fight and to finish the race and to keep the faith. Let's take a deeper look at sustaining faith. Yes, sir. Yeah, what Rocky said is for the first 16 miles, everyone could make it through that, and then they hit what's called a wall, right? They call it the wall, and some say it's 16, some say 18 miles, but everyone can kind of get to that first part, but it's this other side of that wall, and that's what this verse compared to spirituality is talking about. And we're going to jump into that. Digging into it a little bit, first a reminder, we've spent some time in Hebrews 11. We're not really going back there today, but we are going to go to Hebrews 12. Before we get to that, just a reminder about Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11, remember, was written to Christians who were starting to get a little bit shaky. It was very similar to the church in Galatia that Paul wrote a note to, really about, hey, don't fall back here towards Judaism, or don't lean towards Judaism. That's not going to get you there. It's about faith in Jesus. So that's what it was about. In chapter 11, we walked through some of the named and some of the unnamed heroes of the faith. And really the powerful message, my aunt, Karen Stanley, good morning, Missy, that's what I call her. She watches all these lessons, and she said to her the thing that was so powerful about Hebrews 11 to her was not necessarily that what they did and what they overcame, which is plenty powerful, but the fact of how flawed they were and how important it is to us to be able to see their flaws and know that we too, with all of our flaws, can be a hero of the faith. Well, we looked at those, and the powerful message was simply that Abel and Enoch, and Noah and Abraham, Moses, Sarah, Rahab, Daniel, and many others, they endured sufferings, they overcame obstacles, and they ran the race of faith that was before them. Well, we have obstacles, and we're not the first to run. What you see here in the verses, these two verses before we get to Hebrews 12, and all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should be made perfect. What that perfect is that they weren't going to be completed. It wasn't finished until Jesus came. Even for them, for all time, could be made complete by Jesus. Then, after that, the writer, which I do think was Paul, others don't. I think it was Paul, and I think these two verses are part of what points to it being Paul, in my opinion. The writer then says, therefore. So he says, you've got all this. They had this. Because there were so many of them, because of what they showed you, therefore, since God has provided something better for us, and since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, since we have all of these, 16 by name in Hebrews 11, and numerous others by deed, since we have them, then we should know that if those imperfect people can race the Christian race well, then certainly so can we. And then he gets into how. How do you do this? How do you sustain your faith? And how do you run the Christian race well? Well, first and foremost, lay aside every weight. Now, if you think about this through running, if you think about it like a marathon, well, it's pretty logical. Now, one thing I'd say to you, I could say, well, you're not going to go out and run a marathon in cowboy boots, but my father-in-law would try. There's no doubt about it. That man would wear cowboy boots to do anything. But if you're going to run a race, if someone's running a race that has any kind of distance to it, and particularly one that's 26.2 miles, one that you sweat 1.5 gallons of water off, one that requires incredible energy stores and tremendous training over time, if you're going to run that race, you're going to unload the weight. Matter of fact, if you notice that picture I showed you, what are people wearing? A light pair of shorts and a tank top or some kind of really light shirt. Why? It's less weight that they're carrying, and each ounce matters as you're going. Well, the spiritual application, which is really simple here, is exactly the same. Notice, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings to us, so closely. What is weight? Onkos, bulk. But it's also this, it actually speaks to an encumbrance. It's something, it's this burden that gets in our way. It's a burden that slows us down. And there's also sin that can grab us and hold us back. So it's actually saying two things. You got to get rid of the burdens, but you also have to step away from the sin. Because if you don't do both, you're not going to be able to run this race. Matthew 11:28 through 29 says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." Psalm 55:22, "Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you." Philippians 4:6, "Don't be anxious about anything." And Ephesians 4:22, "Put off your old self." All of those things are what the Hebrew writer here is talking about. Unload the weight and step away from sin. For us, we battle with certain things. Sometimes we battle with bitterness, where someone's hurt us. And that just sits on us, pulling us back. That's one of those weights that keeps us where we can't run. And it literally, that's why, when we talk about, sometimes lack of forgiving someone, it does destroy you. Well, that's why, because it's that weight. It's on the shoulders. You can't get past it. We also can really struggle sometimes with things that are actually even good. We can like something so much that's not a bad thing, something that's not a sinful thing, and it's not a bad thing, but we can like it so much that it distracts us from our race, which then makes it bad. So number one, if we're going to run, if we're going to sustain for a marathon, for this Christian marathon, then we're going to have to unload. My coach in high school used to say that. He didn't have to say it to me because I was about that big around. I weighed about 100 pounds. But he'd say it to others. He'd say, "Unload that trailer, boy." That's how he'd talk about it. That's exactly the first thing here. We have to unload to run this race. The second thing the writer talks about is running with endurance. Now, endurance, if you think about it, different types of races require different things. If you're going to go run a sprint, you don't have to have a lot of endurance. And by the way, that's kind of what I've always been built for. I always used to say, well, all my muscles are short twitch, so I'm only good for sprinting. And that's actually kind of true. But if we're going to run a sprint, we're going to do one thing. If we're going to run a 5K, which by the way is 3.2 miles, a little long for my son-in-law. He's sitting back there in the back. Did I ever tell you guys that story? I'd been training for a 5K, and I was all ready for it. I told Dee Dee I was going to say something bad about you this morning, Kelly. I was all ready for this 5K. This is about 5 years ago, I think. He was in his early 30s. And he said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" I said, "Well, I'm running that 5K up there at the shops at Highland Village." He said, "Well, I'll come run with you." And I said, "Well, you hadn't been running 5Ks or anything." He goes, "You're an old man." And I'm not. So I got this. I said, "Okay, see you in the morning." So he was there ready to go. We get to that first mile marker, and as we're going by, they got Gatorade and water in these little bitty cups. Well, for me, I was like, I can't do that because if I stop, I won't be able to get this train going again. So I just kept my little slow run going. He goes, "I'll be right with you." He goes over and gets a drink of water. We get on the last half mile, and he goes, "I got to tie my shoe." I never saw him again. Now, if he would have trained for about a week, he would have crushed me. He would have run by me like I was standing there, but I caught him untrained. Listen, when we run a race, we have to understand the race we're in. And so from a runner perspective, that's what the writer's saying here. This is not some short thing. You need to prepare yourselves, and you need to choose. You need to choose. Isn't it funny that when we're running from something, we often have more energy for the run than we do when we're running to something? And in many ways here, that's what's being said. There's this deep message. Well, what's the deep message? Well, you can see what this endurance means. It means a patient enduring, a steadfastness, a constant, a sustaining. That's really what it's about. I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of people in my life who obey the gospel and they are just lit up about Jesus. And then they disappear 3 or 4 months later, sometimes a year later. They just vanish. Well, that's not what running with endurance looks like. Brad? Well said, Brad. Brad said that, we think today we're more like pickups, that we can carry the weight, and all that does is make us burn more fuel, and then we just run out of gas. So well said, Brad. But this endurance thing really is, Jesus talked about it in Luke chapter 8. We mentioned that, I think, in lesson 2 here, where he talked about the soul and how that shallow soul just doesn't grow and sustain because it's not built for the long haul. I would just simply submit to you that what the writer is calling for here is make a choice, make a commitment, because endurance is about passion. Endurance is about the driving force and whether it's going to drive enough to keep you in it. Whether it's fear or reward or a little mixture of both, that's what's called out. We should choose to get up and read his word every day even when we don't feel like it. We should choose to stay focused on the mission that we're on, even when it doesn't seem like it's going that well, and even when others are kind of peeling off. We should choose to follow Jesus even when people hurt us or oppose us or neglect us. And we should choose to follow Jesus even when things are really difficult. As I told you, I've never run a marathon. Never have. There's somebody in the room, though, that probably knows me better than anybody on this planet that would tell you, I don't quit anything. The only way I stop doing something is if I fall down and cannot get back up. And if I fall down, I'm likely to crawl. And what I've learned in my life is that when things get hard, doesn't matter, sporting event, life events, when things get hard, what I've always defaulted to is just take the next step. Just think about taking the next step. And I think in many ways that's what the writer's saying here. When things get tough, just take the next step. Just get up and read your Bible. Just get up and go to church. Just get up and find somebody to help today and just pray. So number 2, we're to just keep putting one step in front of the other to sustain our faith. Simply not stop. Number 3, what's interesting is the race that is set before us, if you look there in the writing. Great runners, successful runners, study the course. They study the terrain. They study the weather. They study all the things that are necessary to really be successful in this particular course, because the other courses are very different. Very, very different. And if you just say it's just 26.2 miles, it doesn't matter where it's at or otherwise, you're not going to be as successful. The same thing here spiritually is pointed to. We're to run this race. Notice what race is. You see the Greek word there? The course that is set before us. This particular verse, that word is agon or agony. Sound familiar? It's a word used for conflict or struggle. By the way, it's one of Paul's favorite words. You can see the many places that he used it. And really, that's the call out here. We're being called out to run our race. I love Acts 20:24. Paul said, "But I do not count my life of any value, nor is precious to myself, if only I may finish my course." You notice that? My course. Well, we all have a different course. Some of us run by ourselves. Some of us have an encouraging person running along with us. Some of us have a discouraging person running along with us. Some of us run this race while taking care of a sick spouse for many, many years. And some of us run this race with great loss and difficult life events. We all are in some ways the same race, but in some ways it's really different. Well, what does the Bible say about running the course that's set before us? James 1, count it all joy when you meet the trials of various kinds. Those are very personal trials that are very specific to us running ours. Romans 5:3 says, we rejoice in our suffering, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. 1 Peter 1, verses 6 and 7 says, in this rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials. 2 Corinthians 4:17 says, for this light momentary affliction. You ever feel like that? It doesn't feel like a light momentary affliction when you're in it. But when you've overcome it and you look back, then you can see it as that. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sorry, I literally, these lights are so bright, it's like, yes, sir. Around the southern. Mm-hmm. That's right. Yes, so what he's talking about is that the story of yes, thank you. What he's talking about is when Phidippides went back to proclaim the victory in Marathon, but it was also to say that they would be flanking around the sea, that the Persians would be, and by standing on the shore, just that show of force kept them from being there. Thank you. Well said. So on this last one, this third one, this race that sits before us, I love Peter. Love Peter. I love him because Peter's like us. Very more fallible, it seems like, than others. If you look at John chapter 21, we see a particular story that John is telling, and it's interesting that it's John telling it. And we know this, you know it well, but verse 15 it says, "And when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?' And he said, 'Yes, Lord.' And he said, 'Feed my lambs.'" And you know what he says as he walks on down through verse 17? He says this same thing in essence 3 times. "Do you love me?" "Yes, Lord." "Feed my sheep." To the point that Peter was a little bit frustrated by the time he had finished the 3rd time. And then we see in verse 18, and this is Jesus saying, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you're old, you'll stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." And then notice what's said there. This is said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to Peter, "Follow me." What's all this said? It was Jesus saying, "Peter, you've got a really difficult race ahead of you. You're going to be really challenged sometimes. Know that. And no matter what, follow me. And no matter what, feed my sheep." Then I want you to notice what happens next. In verse 20, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had leaned back against him during the supper, and said, "Lord, who is this going to betray you?" That's what the disciple said to Jesus at the supper. And then I want you to notice what Peter says here to Jesus. And when Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" And Jesus said, "Hey, if I want to keep him around forever, that has nothing to do with you, Peter." That's in essence what he's saying. He's saying, "Peter, you just need to follow me. You need to run your race. Whatever is before you, quit looking to the side. Quit saying, 'But what about this person?' That's not necessarily fair, is it?" That's what Peter was saying somewhat. Now, what's beautiful, though, what we know a little bit from history is that we saw what Peter wrote, and we know what Peter's life was about. And about 34 years after this, Peter was crucified. Crucified, as in on a cross. And the ancient writers said that he begged to be crucified with his head downwards because he didn't consider himself worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. Now, that's not scripture. That's from ancient writers during that time. But I could see the passion of Peter saying that. Number 3 in this lesson, we're to run the race that's set before us, not wondering why ours is different, or maybe why ours is more difficult. And by the way, we're often not right when we think ours is more difficult than someone else. That someone else is just doing a much better job of just running the race instead of whining or spending a lot of energy doing other things. And then the 4th thing that the Hebrew writer said was this: looking to Jesus, the founder and protector of our faith. When you're running a marathon, you cannot see the finish for 90% of the race. 90% of it. So you can't focus on the finish. And you also, at least what runners that I've read about would say, and I know this about myself, I haven't run a marathon, but I've done a pentathlon. And the 10K run in that almost killed me. I was wearing Chuck Taylor basketball shoes. It was a bad choice of shoes. And I can remember still thinking in my head, I have this much further to go, and that was just killing me. Instead of focusing on the prize and looking forward based on the goal, not how much pain was still yet to come. What's written here, this looking to Jesus, I don't think the English Standard Version, many of the versions get this as right as they should. They don't get it as well as the American Standard. The American Standard is spot on with what the Greek words say. Instead of saying looking to Jesus, it says fixing our eyes upon Jesus. So looking to Jesus, fixing our eyes upon Jesus, the founder, the author, and the finisher of our faith. That's how we stay connected. Don't fix your eyes on the race ahead. Don't look at the other runners either. You know, preachers will disappoint you. Elders will disappoint you. Church members will. Family members will disappoint you. If we've got our race, our Christian race, tied to other people, we're going to get disappointed somewhere, and often multiple times along the way. But if we fix our eyes on Jesus, he will sustain us, and he will never disappoint us. And by the way, it's the only way that we can finish the race. Here underneath the slide, I just put a note for myself that said, let us run, but I want to tell you how I want to finish this morning with this simple paragraph. It's all in your heart. Hebrews 12 is telling us, run the race God set before you. All caps, you specifically. Keep on running. When it's hard, just keep putting one foot in front of the other, one step in front of the other. Don't let the things of the world drag you down or weight you down. Don't look at your circumstances. Don't look at other people. Don't look at yourself and your own weaknesses. Just keep your eyes fixed on Jesus and to run the race that he set before you. Next week, we're going to close up the class. In the class, we're going to end next week on defending our faith. Thank you very much for your attention this morning.